Johnny Carson reigned as the undisputed king of late-night television for 3 decades, and during that time his guest chair became the most coveted seat in show business. To appear on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was more than just a publicity stop. It could launch a career, revive a fading reputation, or cement a star's place in the cultural spotlight. Carson hosted hundreds of actors, comedians, musicians, and political figures, but among them were a select few who stood out as not only memorable guests, but as people he genuinely admired and enjoyed sharing the stage with. These weren't just celebrities who drew big ratings. They were individuals who made Carson laugh, who treated his staff with respect. So let's revisit 10 of Johnny Carson's most beloved guests, the people whose presence brought out the very best in the man who defined late night.
Lucille Ball's relationship with Johnny Carson represented the rare meeting of two television giants who not only respected each other, but also shared a deep appreciation for discipline, craft, and the courage it took to dominate an industry built on fleeting stardom. By the time Lucy appeared on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, she was more than a beloved comedian. She was a pioneer, the first woman to run a major television studio, the visionary who reshaped sitcoms with I Love Lucy, and the woman whose timing and fearlessness inspired generations of performers. Carson admired Lucy because she came prepared but never stiff. She knew how to make an entrance, how to set up a joke, and most importantly, how to make the host look good, which was rarer than people realized. Where some stars used Carson's stage to boast or to bulldoze the conversation, Lucy treated it as a duet. She laughed at Johnny's asides, fed him stories that opened into punchlines, and always seemed willing to poke fun at herself. She told tales of her trademark red hair accidentally turning green from a botched dye job, or of trying to keep a straight face with Desi Arnaz during a rehearsal gone wrong, and she delivered them not with the arrogance of a legend, but with the humility of someone still in love with her craft. Behind the scenes, staff adored her. She asked about their families, cracked jokes with the makeup artists, and refused special treatment, reminding one young assistant that we're all working under the same hot lights. Carson, who quietly judged every guest by how they treated his crew, took note. What bonded the two most deeply, however, was their mutual understanding of how much pressure came with being the face of a show that millions depended on every night. Carson once remarked to Ed McMahon that Lucy was the easiest interview in television because she never needed a setup. She was already 5 steps ahead of the punchline. For audiences, their chemistry was electric, two masters volleying laughs and respect across a desk. For Carson, Lucy embodied everything he wished Hollywood could be: hardworking, generous, and unafraid of looking silly in pursuit of a laugh. And as one era of television royalty passed the torch to another, their appearances together felt like moments carved in stone, reminders that television could still be about joy rather than ego. That same spirit of authenticity and humility would shine again with another guest who became one of Carson's favorites, an actor who represented old Hollywood decency and small-town values like no one else, Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart brought something to The Tonight Show that very few guests ever could, an air of quiet authenticity that resonated with both Carson and the audience in ways that went beyond jokes or anecdotes. By the 1970s and 80s, Stewart was already a living monument to classic Hollywood, the everyman hero of It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and countless other films that had cemented his place in the cultural imagination. What Carson adored about Stewart wasn't just his resume, but his remarkable humility. Stewart often seemed almost embarrassed by praise, deflecting compliments with a shy smile or a self-deprecating joke. When Carson would introduce him with a litany of achievements, Stewart would shake his head and say, "Oh shucks, Johnny, I just got lucky," a phrase that belied the decades of hard work, discipline, and raw talent that had carried him from Indiana, Pennsylvania to the heights of Hollywood. One of the most famous moments in Tonight Show history came when Stewart read a simple poem he had written about his dog, Bo. What began as a lighthearted tribute soon turned into an emotional confession of love and loss, and by the end, Stewart's voice cracked with grief.
Carson, visibly moved, struggled to hold back tears, and the audience sat in silence before erupting in applause. That moment captured why Stewart was such a treasured guest. He wasn't afraid to be vulnerable, to show that behind the Hollywood legend was a man who loved deeply and hurt deeply. Off camera, Stewart was equally gracious. Crew members remembered how he would arrive early, shake hands with everyone from stagehands to interns, and write personal thank you notes after appearances. For Carson, who privately judged celebrities by their treatment of staff, Stewart's decency stood out in stark contrast to the arrogance and cruelty of others. He represented the kind of old-fashioned integrity that Carson both respected and longed for in an industry too often consumed by ego. Their conversations often drifted to Americana, small-town life, and the values that seemed to be slipping away in modern Hollywood. And though Carson rarely revealed his private thoughts, with Stewart he seemed at ease, almost wistful, as if Stewart reminded him of the simplicity he himself craved. It was this mix of humility, humanity, and humor that made Stewart one of Johnny's most cherished guests, a man who could sit in the spotlight and still seem like your neighbor from down the street. And just as Stewart embodied quiet sincerity, another of Carson's favorite guests, Carol Burnett, brought the opposite energy, playful, spontaneous, and larger than life, yet still grounded in the same authenticity Johnny prized.
Carol Burnett was the kind of guest who could transform The Tonight Show stage into a playground, and Johnny Carson relished every moment she was there because she embodied the joy of comedy without ever letting ego get in the way. By the time she began appearing with Johnny regularly, she was already a household name thanks to The Carol Burnett Show, a groundbreaking variety program that proved women could lead and command comedy on network television with the same authority as men. Carson admired Carol not only for her talent, but for her bravery, her willingness to look silly, to break into outrageous faces or characters, to laugh at herself when a bit went wrong. Unlike many Hollywood stars who arrived armed with pre-packaged stories rehearsed to death by publicists, Carol thrived on spontaneity. She loved being surprised, she loved reacting to Johnny's quick jabs, and she especially loved when something unscripted turned into gold. One night, when a sound effect accidentally misfired during a sketch setup, Carol seized the moment, riffed on it for several minutes, and had both Johnny and Ed McMahon doubled over in laughter. Carson would later remark that she had the fastest comic instincts of anyone I've ever sat across from. Yet beneath the antics, Carol also carried herself with kindness. Staff members recalled how she went out of her way to remember names, how she brought small gifts for stagehands around the holidays, and how she would check in with young writers or interns, encouraging them with the kind of warmth usually reserved for close friends. For Carson, whose private blacklist often reflected how poorly stars treated crew, Carol was a shining example of the opposite. Someone who radiated respect to everyone, regardless of their status. Their on-air chemistry was undeniable. Johnny's dry wit played perfectly against Carol's exuberance, and together they could turn a simple exchange into comedy that felt as though it was happening in your living room among old friends. Audiences adored her not only because she was funny, but because she was real, a trait Carson valued above all. When she occasionally spoke about the challenges of balancing career, motherhood, and the pressures of being a woman in comedy, Johnny listened with genuine respect, giving her space to shine as more than just a clown. She reminded him of what comedy was supposed to be: joyful, inclusive, and liberating. And as one of television's great pioneers, she represented the kind of authenticity Johnny cherished in his favorite guests. Yet if Carol Burnett brought energy and playfulness, the next guest Carson deeply admired, Orson Welles, brought something altogether different. Intellectual depth, theatrical gravitas, and a touch of magic that fascinated Johnny in its own way. Orson Welles was a guest unlike any other, and Johnny Carson, though sometimes wary of outsized personalities, held a special admiration for him because Welles brought to The Tonight Show a rare mix of intellect, performance, and mystery. By the time he sat opposite Johnny, Welles had already achieved near mythical status. The wunderkind who revolutionized cinema with Citizen Kane. The maverick director who fought with studios, the actor whose booming voice and commanding presence could fill any stage. Yet what fascinated Carson most was not just Welles's reputation, but his ability to weave stories that mesmerized audiences. When Orson spoke, the studio seemed to shrink, every ear tuned to his grand narratives about Hollywood battles, European adventures, or his encounters with royalty and rogues alike. Carson, usually the conductor of the conversation, often leaned back and allowed Welles to command the rhythm because he knew the audience was spellbound. More than that, Welles often brought an element of surprise, his passion for magic. He would perform sleight of hand tricks, coin vanishes, or card manipulations with the precision of a seasoned magician. And Johnny, an amateur magician himself in his youth, lit up with boyish delight. That bond, rooted in a shared fascination with illusions, gave their conversations a special warmth. Behind the scenes, Welles could be demanding, but never in the cruel or dismissive way that earned others a place on Carson's private blacklist. Instead, he treated the crew like collaborators, often praising camera operators for capturing the drama of his gestures or complimenting makeup artists for their work. Staff recalled how he would sit in the green room telling stories to interns, leaving them wide-eyed as though they had stepped into another world. For Carson, Welles represented the grandeur of old Hollywood without the toxicity, an artist with flaws, certainly, but also with generosity and curiosity. Their interactions weren't always comedic. Sometimes they bordered on philosophical, touching on art, fame, and the fleeting nature of time. Johnny respected that Welles never condescended to the format of late night. He treated it as a serious stage worthy of his talents. And while some viewers may have tuned in expecting light banter, they found themselves instead in the presence of a raconteur who made even the smallest anecdote feel like theater. Carson, who valued authenticity in whatever form it took, considered Welles a kind of magician, not just with cards, but with words. And just as Welles brought depth and grandeur, the next guest Johnny treasured most embodied the opposite. George Burns, whose simplicity, wit, and longevity reminded Carson of comedy's purest roots. George Burns was, in many ways, the living bridge between vaudeville and modern television, and Johnny Carson adored having him on The Tonight Show because he carried with him not only decades of comedic wisdom, but also a kind of effortless charm that transcended generations. By the time Burns joined Carson on stage, he was already a legend, having conquered vaudeville with his wife and partner Gracie Allen, transitioned to radio with ease, and later mastered television and film, all while maintaining a style so simple it bordered on timeless. What Carson loved about Burns was his ability to distill comedy into its purest form: a pause, a raised eyebrow, a perfectly placed one-liner delivered with a cigar in hand. He never needed spectacle or gimmicks, just timing and truth. Audiences roared with laughter, even at the smallest observation, and Carson, himself a student of timing, often looked at Burns with something approaching reverence. Off-camera, Burns was equally captivating. He carried himself with grace, often telling young comedians backstage, "Don't try to be funny, just be yourself and let the laughs come to you," advice that Carson himself echoed throughout his career. For Johnny, who had studied comedy masters from a distance, sharing the stage with Burns felt like learning directly from the source. There was also something deeply comforting about Burns' presence. Even into his 80s and 90s, he radiated energy and positivity, reminding everyone that comedy and life were marathons, not sprints. Crew members loved him because he was warm, unpretentious, and genuinely interested in people no matter their role. One staffer recalled how Burns asked about her child's piano lessons, remembered the details months later, and checked in on progress the next time he appeared. A level of kindness rare among Hollywood royalty. Carson, who measured guests not only by their performance, but also by their humanity, treasured these qualities. On air, their exchanges were playful, Carson tossing setups that Burns would knock down with ease, the two men clearly delighting in each other's company. Johnny once joked, "George will outlive us all." And, in a way, Burns did, his career stretching past his 100th birthday, his wit undimmed. For Carson, Burns was proof that comedy was not about chasing trends, but about connecting to audiences with honesty and heart. He embodied the continuity of the art form, the reminder that what made people laugh in the 1920s could still make them laugh decades later. And if George Burns represented the classic, seasoned wisdom of comedy, the next guest Carson cherished most, Bob Newhart, showed how that tradition could be reinvented in the modern era, with a style of humor that was understated, cerebral, and uniquely his own.
Bob Newhart was one of Johnny Carson's favorite guests because he embodied a kind of comedy that felt effortless, intellectual, and quietly subversive, a style that fit perfectly with Carson's own dry wit. Unlike many performers who came onto The Tonight Show armed with exaggerated stories or over-the-top antics, Newhart's humor lived in understatement. He specialized in the art of the pause, the hesitant delivery, the stammer that suggested more than it revealed, and audiences loved him for it. His famous telephone routines where he would play one side of a conversation had already made him a legend by the time he became a Carson regular. But what struck Johnny most was how naturally that same understated brilliance carried into casual conversation. Sitting across from Newhart, Carson could throw him the smallest setup, something as simple as asking about a vacation or a golf game, and Newhart would spin it into a piece of comedy gold by focusing on the minutia, the awkwardness, the ordinary details that everyone recognized but few could articulate. Carson admired that because it reflected his own philosophy that comedy wasn't about forcing laughs, but about revealing truths. Off-camera, Newhart was known for his humility. Despite his enormous success, including Grammy-winning albums and hit television shows, he never acted the star. Crew members recalled how he would quietly slip into the studio, greet everyone with a polite handshake, and often spend time chatting with the writers, praising their work. He wasn't loud, he wasn't demanding, and he never made anyone feel beneath him. For Carson, who had seen the worst side of celebrity arrogance, Newhart's modesty was refreshing. Their rapport on stage was a masterclass in timing. Johnny with his sly smile and perfectly phrased questions, and Bob with his hesitant, almost reluctant delivery that drew bigger laughs the longer he stalled. Sometimes Carson would laugh so hard at Newhart's understated punchlines that he'd struggle to keep the show moving, and audiences could sense that their laughter wasn't staged, but genuine. They admired each other as craftsmen, men who understood that less could be more, and that silence could be as funny as words. In many ways, Newhart carried forward the wisdom of comedians like George Burns, but gave it a modern, minimalist twist, proving that wit and intelligence could carry as much weight as slapstick or spectacle. For Carson, who valued intelligence in comedy, Bob Newhart was a guest who reminded him why subtlety mattered. And if Newhart represented the quiet, cerebral side of humor, the next guest Johnny treasured, Burt Reynolds, embodied the opposite. Bold, unpredictable, and gleefully mischievous, bringing with him a different kind of energy that kept Carson and his audience on their toes. Burt Reynolds was the kind of guest who brought unpredictability and sheer fun to The Tonight Show, and Johnny Carson loved him for it because Burt never treated the interview like a performance to be managed, but rather like a party to be enjoyed. By the time he appeared regularly with Johnny in the 1970s and 80s, Reynolds was one of the biggest stars in the world, the face of box office hits like Deliverance, Smokey and the Bandit, and The Longest Yard, yet he carried himself with a mix of swagger and self-deprecation that kept audiences glued to the screen. Unlike many leading men who projected aloofness, Reynolds was quick to poke fun at his own macho image, joking about his infamous Cosmopolitan centerfold, or laughing at the absurdities of celebrity life. Carson adored this because it gave him endless openings to riff, and together the two created some of The Tonight Show's most outrageous moments. Perhaps the most famous came in 1978 when Burt and Johnny, joined by Dom DeLuise, launched into a whipped cream pie fight that left the set covered in cream and the audience roaring. For Carson, who prided himself on control, it was a rare moment of gleeful chaos that he fully embraced because Burt made it feel natural rather than forced.
Offstage, Reynolds was equally beloved by the crew. He treated staff with warmth, joked with camera operators, and often hung around the set long after taping to swap stories with Johnny and Ed McMahon. One assistant recalled that Burt once brought gifts for several interns, telling them, "Don't let Hollywood chew you up," advice that revealed his awareness of the industry's darker side. What made him special to Carson wasn't just the laughs, but the camaraderie. Burt treated Johnny like an equal, not just as a host to be tolerated, and their genuine friendship shone through the screen. Viewers could sense that they weren't just watching two celebrities, they were watching two friends tease each other, prank each other, and enjoy the ride. Carson once remarked privately that Burt never played the star, he played the guy you'd want to have a beer with, and that relatability made him one of The Tonight Show's most unforgettable guests. And if Reynolds represented Hollywood's wild, unpredictable side, another of Carson's favorites, James Garner, embodied a quieter strength, a down-to-earth humility and decency that reminded Johnny of what stardom could look like when grounded in authenticity.
James Garner was another of Johnny Carson's favorite guests, and for good reason. He embodied the kind of authenticity and humility that Carson admired above all else. Known for his easygoing charm in Maverick and his rugged decency in the Rockford Files, Garner projected an image of a man who could be both witty and tough. But what struck Johnny most was how much that screen persona matched the real man sitting across from him on The Tonight Show couch. Garner never seemed to play a role when he appeared with Carson. He spoke plainly, laughed easily, and carried himself with the modesty of someone who never quite bought into the hype of Hollywood. Carson valued that because so many stars arrived with rehearsed stories or carefully crafted images, while Garner simply told the truth, even if the truth wasn't flattering. He would share anecdotes about botched stunts, on-set squabbles, or his own missteps with a grin that made the audience feel like they were in on the joke rather than watching a polished performance. Off camera, staff remembered him as one of the kindest celebrities to ever step into the studio. He shook hands with crew members, chatted with interns, and treated everyone like equals. One longtime stagehand said Garner never acted like a guest, he acted like a neighbor who just stopped by to visit. For Carson, who quietly assessed people by their treatment of his staff, that meant everything. Their rapport on stage reflected this natural ease. Johnny would toss Garner a sly line, and Garner would volley back with a quip that felt unrehearsed, their conversation flowing like two friends at a bar rather than a late-night interview. Audiences loved him because he seemed approachable, the kind of Hollywood star who might actually sit down for coffee with you and ask about your day. Carson privately admired that Garner never let fame change him, never lost his perspective, and never treated show business as anything more than a job he was lucky to have. Their bond was rooted in that shared sense of Midwestern humility, a recognition that behind the glamour, they were both just men who had worked hard and caught some breaks along the way. For Johnny, Garner was proof that authenticity could survive in an industry built on illusion, and that truth only deepened his affection for him as a guest. And if Garner represented the honest, grounded side of stardom, the next guest Johnny Carson treasured most, Jack Benny, symbolized something even more personal, the comedic inspiration who helped shape Johnny's own style long before he ever sat behind the Tonight Show desk.
Jack Benny held a place in Johnny Carson's heart that went beyond admiration. He was one of the comedic architects who had shaped Johnny's own sensibilities long before Carson became the king of late night. By the time Benny appeared on The Tonight Show, he was already an institution, a man whose timing, self-deprecating humor, and mastery of silence had influenced generations of comedians. Carson, who grew up studying radio and early television, often said that Benny taught him one of comedy's most valuable lessons, that a pause could be as funny as a punchline. When Benny visited the show, Johnny treated him with a reverence usually reserved for royalty, leaning into his questions not just as a host, but as a student eager to draw wisdom from a master. Benny's shtick, playing the vain, penny-pinching miser who never quite realized he was the butt of the joke, never grew old, and Carson delighted in giving him opportunities to revive those routines for a new audience. What made Benny so endearing to Johnny, though, wasn't just the act. It was the kindness behind it. Crew members remembered how Benny never traveled without personally thanking the staff, often shaking every hand he could before leaving the building. He was soft-spoken, polite, and genuinely humble, qualities that aligned perfectly with Carson's own unspoken values. On stage, their chemistry was a joy to watch. Carson would prod him about his age or his supposed cheapness, and Benny, with perfect timing, would let the silence linger before delivering a deadpan reply that brought the house down. Johnny sometimes struggled to contain his laughter, not because he hadn't heard similar lines before, but because Benny's delivery made even old jokes feel brand new. For Carson, hosting Benny was like paying tribute to the man who had paved the way, and it gave him a rare chance to express gratitude in front of millions of viewers. When Benny passed away in 1974, Johnny dedicated part of The Tonight Show to reflecting on his influence, speaking with a solemn sincerity that he rarely allowed into his monologues. "We all owe him something," Carson said, his voice tinged with emotion. That debt was clear every time Benny graced his stage. He wasn't just another guest, he was the embodiment of comedy's enduring power, the living proof that wit, humility, and timing could outlast trends. And as Carson's career stretched into the 1980s, he found himself drawn not only to the pioneers who shaped him, but also to stars who represented the glamour and mystery of Hollywood itself. None more dazzling and none more surprising in her warmth than Elizabeth Taylor.
Elizabeth Taylor was perhaps the most glamorous star ever to sit in Johnny Carson's guest chair. Yet what made her one of his favorites wasn't just her fame or beauty, it was the way she consistently surprised him with warmth, wit, and an unexpected humility. By the time she appeared on The Tonight Show, Taylor was already a legend twice over. The child actress who grew into one of the world's greatest leading ladies in films like Cleopatra and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and the tabloid sensation whose marriages, illnesses, and scandals made her a permanent fixture of public fascination. Carson could easily have treated her as untouchable royalty, but what delighted him was how she disarmed that image the moment she sat down. Elizabeth had a knack for laughing at herself, whether it was joking about the extravagance of Cleopatra's costumes or gently poking fun at the endless jokes about her multiple marriages. Her presence carried undeniable star power. Audiences leaned forward the moment she appeared, but she never lorded it over the set. Crew members recalled how she thanked everyone personally, often lingering after taping to chat with interns or makeup artists, and how she spoke to each person with the same sincerity she gave Johnny on camera. Carson admired this because it contrasted so sharply with the arrogance he had seen in other stars. On air, their rapport sparkled. Johnny would toss her a sly comment about her whirlwind personal life, and Taylor would shoot back with a witty, self-aware retort that left the audience roaring. But she wasn't just a glamorous conversationalist, she was also deeply human. Taylor spoke candidly about her struggles with health, her battles with addiction, and her later activism in the fight against AIDS at a time when few celebrities dared to even say the word. Johnny respected her courage and gave her the platform to speak honestly, a sign of the deep trust between them. For Carson, Elizabeth Taylor represented a rare blend of Hollywood mystique and genuine humanity, proof that even the most famous star in the world could also be gracious, grounded, and brave. Her appearances weren't just ratings gold, they were reminders that authenticity could exist even under the brightest spotlight. And with Taylor, Carson's long list of favorites felt complete, spanning comedians, actors, pioneers, and legends who each, in their own way, brought out the best in him and reminded America why The Tonight Show mattered. These 10 guests were not simply entertainers, but the people Johnny Carson trusted most to share his stage, and their legacy lives on in the laughter and memories they created together. If you enjoyed this journey into Johnny Carson's world and the stars he cherished most, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from the golden age of Hollywood and television history.